So you like it down in Florida, Key West? That is pretty country.
Mm-hmm. I like sky.
Yeah.
Horizon.
Yeah, well, you've got it there. Yeah, it's pretty. Do you get a chance to go underwater much?
Just snorkeling.
Yeah.
I don't know how to do the other.
Yeah. Arthur Clarke used to spend about a third of his waking hours underwater. Welcome very much to Conversations, where it's my pleasure, personal pleasure, and to welcome to the program Dr. Barbara Ehrenreich. And Barbara Ehrenreich is an author who I had said off camera has marshaled the language as well as Winston Churchill in the cause of many, many interesting and important understandings of the human condition and so forth. And Barbara Ehrenreich, welcome very, very much to Conversations.
Well, glad to be here.
And back to New York,
yeah.
where you are now. You've written, you know, so well, Fear of Falling and this sort of thing, and things that you've written, your reputation precedes you, if I may say so. But you've written more recently, and that's what we want to talk about, is Blood Rites, the book on the origins of the passions of war. And we want to talk about that book particularly. But I wonder, maybe you could you share with us a little of your own background, and then just to sort of anchor it, as it were, here, and then we could go on and talk about the book specifically.
Well, it's a little, it's embarrassing because it's such a patchwork background.
Really?
It doesn't, I intended to be a scientist, and actually ended up getting a PhD in biology in New York at Rockefeller University.
Yes.
And, but I was derailed by a war. The war in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Toward the end of the 60s, I just decided, what am I doing? I really could not see spending the rest of my life 14 hours a day at the bench, as we used to say in the laboratory.
Yeah.
I wanted to be more, quote, socially relevant in what I was doing. And that just led to one thing or another, eventually to journalism, to writing a lot initially about healthcare issues. Initially healthcare issues in New York City, the two-class system of healthcare and so on here. And I don't know, one thing led to another, but in this book I come back in some ways to those original concerns. One is war,
yes,
and the other is certain sort of biological questions, which you inevitably have to confront when you talk about something so ancient and so nearly universal in human experience as war.
And you take a really beautifully long biologically historical perspective on the human condition and so forth in the book.
Well, only a non-historian would dare do this.
Oh, really? Well,
no, if you're a historian, you've got your field. It's ancient or it's Middle Ages,
right,
something modern, and you know, the whole thing. I'm not constrained by some kind of disciplinary barriers. I can just look at whatever I want.
Or biology, for that matter. If you take into virology and so forth, you've got a good deal of the expression of human or of living forms on the earth. That's a pretty wide field in and of itself, as opposed to some of the highly specialized fields. Or do you specialize within biology? I mean,
sure. And within biology, my initial specialty was cell biology.
I see.
So I didn't know anything about animals and plants. They were much too big for
really,
me.
Yeah. Do you think that's I don't want to get into this in great depth, but Bucky Fuller, who I used to say, it is appropriate as we move into an information environment where we have so much information that we can recognize patterns. We have a capability of doing that, and that the comprehensivist, or let's say, to use a loaded phrase, the generalist, is a legitimate academic stance for people to have in a field where the academia is all divided down into specialization. Is it a problem, do you think, that we lose the forest for looking at the trees so carefully?
I mean, I think so. Yeah. I think, for me, it's the question is the prime thing. I ask, you know, the question is what gets me going. And I don't care where I'm taken to by that question, whether it's called anthropology or called zoology or history. You know, I'll have to learn a lot. I'll have to do a lot of catching up in some of those areas. But here, I think some of my habits as a journalist help too, because when I would be going into an area, like in researching this book, which took many years, where I didn't know anything, or I was just beginning to read books and articles in an area, I'll just track down the authors of those books and articles and call them up.
Give them a call at the telephone.
In their homes or offices, and say, here I am, I'm reading your book, and I have a question, or I want to know how this fits in with so-and-so, so-and-so's work, or what do you think of this? And almost universally, these people were very nice, very forthcoming, and really, you know, freely added to my education and what their field was.
That's really interesting. Conversation as a means
Yeah.
of academic research.
Sure.
Yeah, in a certain kind of way. That's good. It makes
Yeah.
it fun. You enjoy the writing process. It's not a laborious thing. Some people have
Oh,
it
yeah.
difficult. And you write, if I may say so, it's just the truth. You write beautifully. You write very, very well. Does it come easily to you, or is it a hard? Some people have a difficult time rewriting and laboriously bringing these words out, or how is it with you?
Well, I think of writing as the least of it.
Okay.
The big problem is thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking is the challenging part. Writing, once you've got it thought out, it comes very quickly onto the page. So I in this book I said I'm giving myself a break. I'm not going to worry about how it sounds. There's so much research I want to get out. But I guess I was sufficiently excited by it all, so that some of that shows in how it's written too.
Yeah, you bring an excitement to things. To keep that level of curiosity is really important in the name of education. If we can keep curiosity so people on their own can go and find something that they're really interested in, like on the hunt in a certain sense, it makes the whole human experience much more interesting, I think, as far as what education is about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I always have some big question in my mind.
Right.
I'm sort of a private investigator. I'm
Right.
investigating whatever it is.
Okay, and then you do the journalism. I know you write for Time magazine and so forth. So, hey, good. Now, the book. When did you get the idea of writing it? When did it come from? Blood Rites. And if I may, let me show it if I could, maybe right here. If they can maybe bring it up. Let's see people how it would look in the bookstore. It's called Blood Rites, and it's called Origins
And History.
and History of the Passions of War, and it's in the bookstands now. And when did you get the idea for the book, and how did it come first into your cognition and your idea to write
in
it?
the early 80s, I had written a book about men.
Yeah.
Pretty much covered the subject of men, I
Got
thought,
that
in
all
one
taken care
book.
of?
Yeah,
We'll
in
go
one
into
book
something really-
subject.
yeah,
And
right.
it was called The Hearts of Men, still in print. Anyway, because I had written that book, I was invited to write a foreword to a fascinating book which was being translated from the German into English, called Male Fantasies, which was about German warriors, about the German officer elite, basically between the two world wars. And I got fascinated by this. In fact, I started reading more and more books in order to feel confident enough to even write the foreword. And pretty soon I found that, that I was sort of confronting myself. Here I had opposed wars, any war that had come along in my own lifetime after, as a grown-up person,
after the
Vietnam
Second
War,
War, perhaps. Yeah, right.
Vietnam War and so on. And yet I had really never thought about it intellectually. It always just seemed like a terrible surprise. Oh my God, people are killing each other.
Right.
And I think we all have a little bit of that. We know that the activities that go on in war, that is the actual killing, looting, maiming, are all illegal acts in any normal society, that they're all immoral, illegal acts. Yet when you do those acts in large numbers and call it a war, not only is it not illegal, but it's seen as something very honorable and wonderful and glorious, of course.
Tunes of glory, yeah.
So I thought, I began to see that there was a big question here, and it's something that I had just sort of slid right by throughout my
Probably
life.
a lot of us have, haven't we? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And so you got interested in that.
And then I'll make a confession here.
Yeah, all right, do it right here on here. Right.
I found I actually enjoyed reading about battles.
Oh, really?
And wars. And see, I guess another kind of fascination here is that this is not an area that a lot of women go into. There are not a lot of women to read. It's almost all by men, and it's just an area which has historically been men's only.
Yeah,
not only the fighting,
Clausewitz
but the writing about it and the thinking about it.
Yeah.
So there was a little bit of that pleasure of going where almost no women had gone before.
Well, I see,
finding
right,
out
okay.
what the guys had been doing.
Yeah.
And finding that I actually was pretty interested in how battles were fought and what the weapons were and how the supply trains were organized.
How did Caesar deploy his men and that
Yeah,
sort of thing? Yeah, there's a whole history of war, and it's been glorified in the human history because it's a moment where people the human spirit is motivated in order to have some sort of a foe that you can come up against. That seems to be part of what human beings seem to need, is to have some sort of an enemy, if that's the right term, or dialectic, something against which they can pit their good feelings about what it is they're doing. That's something that seems to be inherent in the human condition, perhaps. I don't know.
Well,
but
I sort of started out thinking, as I think most people do, that the passions of war, that the
Yes.
feelings that go into wars are all hatred and aggression and cruelty and so forth. So the very first surprise, which takes place in about page 6 of the book, is that the feelings people express about war, and warriors as well as non-combatants who are very enthusiastic, are not about hatred or wanting to kill and maim. They're feelings of self-sacrifice, willingness to sacrifice for some great cause or your nation. They're feelings of generosity, altruism,
Camaraderie.
I mean, that it is sadly, I would say, but through war that we often find that bondedness to others, that solidarity with others, it's missing in so much of our lives.
Yes, you're right, yeah.
So that was the first big surprise here.
Purpose, maybe? A sense of purpose?
Sense
or
of purpose,
a purpose beyond the self, in a sense. Yeah,
yeah, a big lifted, I mean, people, again and again, enthusiasts of war, or young men, say, enlisting in World War I, would talk about being lifted out of themselves into something larger than themselves.
Right, and that is something that is, that's an interesting philosophical realm for us to try and get us some idea of what biological purpose or human purpose is. And it's interesting, at the end of the book, you come to some sort of a notion that we might be able to marshal those forces against war itself, which is an interesting sort of turn of phrase and thought and so forth. But you also go into this and you say that, normally we will do in a Marxist dialectic or something, we'll say it's a argumentation over markets, or it's economic this and that, economic interests and border clashes and that sort of thing. But you go right into biological roots that go way back into ancient antiquity of the human
religion.
experience.
Yeah, first quite a bit about religion here, because I'm not throwing out Clausewitz, and I'm not throwing out Marx or anybody else who has written about human motivations that go into war. It was actually more Lenin, I would guess. But
Charles Beard.
I mean, but as I considered these feelings and these, I was not so. I did not feel they could be explained, that all this could be explained in a Clausewitzian manner. And Clausewitz said, war is a rational undertaking. It's something nation-states do when they've exhausted all of diplomacy. So the way to study war is through looking at international relations or political science and so on.
An extension of diplomacy.
Right. And I thought that it would, that I'm not ruling all that out. I'm just saying that another way to look at war is in the context more of things like religion, that it is an activity that brings forth these powerful feelings. It involves a lot of ritual. In between wars, we treat it as a very holy thing. We have our special war-related holidays and our rituals like parades and so on. And so I said, I'm going to look at it not in that conventional sort of economic way. I'm going to look at it here as a blood rite related to the most ancient form of religion or form of religious practice, which is blood sacrifice.
Interesting, yeah, and that seems to go way, way back, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, because as I was thinking of these things, thinking, how can we sacralize? How can we take something as, evil as I think war is, and sacralize it? Well, all the ancient religions had as their central rite an act of blood sacrifice, either of animals or humans. Look at the Old Testament.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
How much of the Old Testament is instructions for what animal gets sacrificed in what way, as a peace offering, a sin offering, whatever. Ancient Hinduism, the ancient Greeks, those religions were absolutely centered on blood sacrifice.
Aztec, Toltec.
Well, yeah, and they didn't have large animals, so they used humans.
Right. Oh, that's interesting.
In Mesoamerica.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's been there, and it's in a sense trying to propitiate. Or if we could go back to the Cro-Magnon caves of France, where they painted on the wall, that's an artistic expression, deities or deified, some people say deified entities of the prey that they were searching or they were hunting and that sort of thing. It became part of it. I'm not sure that's not blood sacrifice, but it's a relating to the people's relationship to the environment around, or to the other fauna. Very often you bring that up, the large cats in Africa, and that a good deal of our evolutionary experience goes before history, far before history. We've been in a relationship to the other biologicals in a way different than perhaps we see ourselves now.
Yeah. Well, the blood sacrificial rites of the
Okay.
ancient religions began to interest me because here's a sort of an analog to war, in that you have an act of killing which is turned into something sacred by the way it is interpreted. And there the interesting thing, and I don't know if this has ever been noted before, it's controversial, but it seems to have gotten by the critics pretty well, is that again and again in those blood sacrifices, the deity that the sacrifice is being offered to is imagined to be actually eating or consuming in some way the sacrifice that is offered to him or her.
Interesting.
Now Jehovah, the God of the Old Testament, is a little too ethereal to actually chomp down on the offerings, but he's often described as savoring the smell or somehow consuming it. You know, there's a sort of a carnal interest on his part too. So that that began to lead me into a whole set of questions about evolution and why do we do these things? What is this human fascination with violence that would mean that as recently as 4,000 years ago, most religious practice on Earth, certainly in the more populated parts of Earth, consisted of slitting an animal's throat or killing a human publicly. What is it between our species and the whole subject of violence? Then,
big subject.
yeah.
Yes.
So when you read the evolutionary theory on that, it was you run into what has been the conventional wisdom, I think, since the 60s or even earlier, and that is it's the man-the-hunter theory.
Yeah.
That humans have always been predators, that we were always hunters, that's our defining activity that distinguishes us from the other primates and so on. And of course we have wars, we're just killers. We have a killer instinct. We used to eat what we killed, now we just stack the bodies or something.
Robert Ardrey.
Yeah,
The Naked Ape.
right.
Yeah.
But I was suspicious, perhaps just intuitively and suspicious, that one thing that was always being left out, it seemed to me, was how did we get from being a fairly cowering creature to being the lord of the savannah?
Now, we've made a big jump there, and I'm not sure we'd gone into that before, but let's see, if I may. It seems that the mitochondrial DNA studies seem to give us a beginning of Homo sapiens sapien maybe
100,000 years ago?
100,000, maybe 200,000
200,000
years ago out of Africa. We're all, that's interesting in and of itself, we're all descended of a common ancestor, all close on to 6 billion of us now, out of Africa. And that you bring up in the book that throughout the bulk of that period of time, the human species, we were very ill-equipped relative to some of the other cats and so forth. We had not claws like a tiger. We couldn't run like an antelope. And most of that period, very likely, the vast majority of our tenure on Earth has been, we were creatures of prey.
Yep.
We were not the predators until relatively recently. That's one of the major themes of your book, is it not? Yeah, you want to spell it out, maybe?
Well, this has been left out. I mean, it's something I think that is embarrassing
Yeah,
to our
right.
species. I mean, and maybe especially embarrassing to males.
Yeah, well,
Who
okay,
because most of the writers have been, because this is a very triumphalist view when you say, oh well, we just got out of the trees into the savannah, picked up a sharpened stick, and then pretty soon we were in charge of the place.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of disadvantages. You mentioned we don't have claws.
That's right.
We don't have sharp teeth. We don't run very fast. Our babies are born in a condition of extreme vulnerability.
Right, and a long-term nurturing process needed.
I've noticed about 25 years in my
Yes,
experience.
yeah, well, it's still growing, right?
Right, but we are, we're a very vulnerable species.
Were.
Yeah. Still are to certain things.
Well, perhaps that's
but-
true, right, that's another issue, but yeah.
So the big question then was, well, then it was occurring to me, just following
Yes.
my trail of thought, was that how did we overcome that? How did we get to the point where we were the leading predators on the planet? How did we go from being this frightened, cowering creature? And the answer that comes from primatology, from the study of primates in the wild, is that very likely what our ancestors did is when confronted with an intruder, a leopard, say.
Leopard particularly, I think, yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
and which was about to snatch a baby or a weak member, an elderly member or something of the group, they probably did what chimpanzees and others will do, and that is band together, stamp, make all the noise you can, wave sticks, but it was a collective defense.
Yes, right.
And that was the interesting thing to me. That was such a clue right there.
Yeah, you had such a point, you had such a poignant line in there about some primates where if one is slightly wounded, in order to keep up with the tribe that's moving along, of say baboons or something, they will do anything to keep up with the tribe, even not eat in order to keep up with the tribe, because if they're left behind, it's death to be alone on the savanna plain or something.
And that was probably true
our
in the evolution of our species and of all primates. There's a reason we are social creatures in the first place, is that there was no surviving as an individual. I mean, a lot of the big cats will not. They won't attack a group, a large group, very readily, but they will pick off the straggler. And so we have learned as a species to stick pretty close together.
And that seems to be in some of the other primates too. I mean, in the baboons and others. And there are lessons that apply to us that probably apply to other. I wonder if these are generalized principles that apply to biological evolution. I don't know. That's maybe
that's what they're saying now in the people who write about evolutionary, human evolution, is that probably like the other primates, we became social because of the threat of predation. So it's beginning to be acknowledged more and more that predation was a very formative thing in our evolution.
I think it's really good you've called this up, because most people, we have been since what, I don't know how many generations back it is that we began to take dominion over the earth, as it were, and got agriculture and civilization. And now animals, we think of them as pets or something, and we have a very different kind of attitude to it. But it's probably good for us to try and think that through. And I don't think it's been written enough that we were in this very, very vulnerable stage through the vast majority, maybe 90% of our tenure on Earth. And that had to have had genetic or, I don't know, genetic or psychological algorithms, as you put it down, that they learned. And that should be understood perhaps better than we do in terms of understanding human behavior that still has application maybe to deep psychological
I think it opens up so much. Like,
yeah.
And I'd like to see people who really know the field, so of psychiatry and so on, to talk about the implications for things like anxiety, which or depression, which is very much a prey-like response to your environment. But the key thing here in relation to war was that we probably fought that first war, that is against the primate, not the primates, the big cats, through this mechanism of collective defense. And my speculation here is that there is an excitement to banding together against a common enemy. That is probably hardwired. And the reason for saying that is that, yeah, you might survive better yourself if you just ran away and climbed a tree. But if you had some emotion impelling you to stick with the group, and through that stamping and yelling and everything, you are more likely to preserve the life of your child or your grandchild.
Yeah, and that would be
that your genes then would go on, because it seems to me that it's something that is like that is activated in us in the excitement of a war, in the excitement of nationalism, that there's an outside enemy somewhere, and that we are to band together and get all pumped up about this way we're bonding to fight that.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that my speculation is that it has its evolutionary roots in the very necessary defense of our species.
Yeah, and that necessary defense also of a social unit that made it possible with this long nurturing process that was part of that is that Ashley Montague used to write very well of the fact that there was a need for there to be a kind of bonding there in order to create a nurturing situation wherein the child itself could be surviving within a unit of, let's say a family unit. But then that would be augmented by there being a social unit that we could become to be comfortable and associated with. Yeah.
And very much need in certain
and
settings.
very much need in order to survive. So this is built in. So that's not well enough understood or anything.
And it's there in so much familiar mythology, for example. Skipping from study of, say, primates in the wild, it's very striking how much of mythology has to do with confronting the beast that is, raging through the area.
At the cave site door. Yeah.
Right. That the great heroes of Greek mythology are the ones who ward off the lion or the whatever, or the sea beast, that a monster that has been sent, and so on. In other forms of mythology, like in in Northern Europe you have Beowulf.
Yes, true.
And this beast Grendel. So this beast is always appearing in mythology, and I think the psychiatric explanation has been that's just something, projection from our imaginations, this terrible beast. I'm saying maybe we should take it a little more literally.
Yeah.
That what they were dealing with in those myths was a threat that was not so far behind them. And if you consider that in ancient Greece, which was a time people had metal weapons, lived in cities, pretty self-confident species by then, they would post at the gates of the city an image of a predator, a wolf or a lion usually. And they said the function of that was to repel the actual animal. So even for people living in cities that recently, say 4,000, 5,000 years ago, there was a danger to the herds, but also a danger to the individual who would stray off into the countryside.
Yeah, to warn them against that. And this attitude is one that seems to appear, or we can find examples of it, throughout the human experience in many parts of the world. It's sort of a universal quality, whether it's in the Hindu background or in the Mahabharata
I
and so forth.
became an expert here on animal attacks on humans.
Really? Yeah?
Yes.
You really researched the whole thing.
Oh, well,
and there was a
yes.
great deal of that going on. You had a very interesting section in there where you spoke about the finding of human remains where the skull and the leopard's eye teeth just met very nicely, and that probably a great deal of human, children and so forth had been, as they say, done in by leopards, particularly in Africa and so forth. But I guess it's been something that can be seen from the paleontology and so forth around the world, right?
Yeah, and there's
and
archaeological.
it has been ignored more than it ought to have
well,
been
that's
in the
you're
research.
talking about was originally when they found these hominid, that is early human skulls that had puncture wounds in them, they said that those must have been caused by other humans, because the tendency is has been anyway, so much against seeing ourselves, our own species, as prey or victims. Yeah. We have to always be the guys on top, right? So they said, these early humans were murderers. This was to prove that the killer instinct was at least 1 million years old.
That's Ehrenreich again, the naked ape, and that sort of thing.
Raymond Dart, actually.
Or Dart,
who worked with him.
Yeah.
But then a South African paleontologist came along just in the 1980s, and he measured those puncture wounds very carefully in the hominid skulls, and showed that the distance between them was exactly the same as the gap between the stabbing teeth of the leopard, the ancient and the modern leopard, as it happens. So rather than, quote, man being always this predator with this killer instinct, a very different picture emerges, I think, if you throw in the factor of predation.
Yeah. Now, if we look at mankind, and they do that, so they would have banded together and perhaps even lauded those who could scare off or frighten off or make go away a leopard or something that was a danger to them. But war is a process of where we begin to take that kind of an attitude toward our own kind. Where does war fit in terms of the biological evolution, other species and so forth, this quality of attacking one's own kind? And when did that fit in, or how do you think that fit in this long paleontological kind of view of things? Do you think there was warring going on, or what do you think?
It's pretty recent. The archaeological evidence we have of war begins around 12,000 years ago. And this would be rock drawings that are unmistakably fighting men from Spain, for example. And then the first evidence of massacres. I mean, there's evidence of homicide that goes way back, individuals with their skulls bashed in. But when you only begin to find whole groups of people killed around 12,000 years ago. So it's pretty recent that we went from fighting animals, both as hunters and as defending our communities, to fighting each other.
You don't think we have records? I mean, and when we reach back before, that's history or prehistory. We go back paleontological. We don't have records that would give us understandings of there having been tribe or group of Homo sapien against other group of Homo sapien, or Homo sapien against other groups of maybe some Homo erectus or something like that, you know?
We don't know.
Right?
I mean, it's a fascinating question, especially with the other groups. Like, what what happened to the Neanderthals, you know?
Right. Yeah.
How come after, you
Yeah.
know, because there was quite a variety of different human-like
Yeah.
primates at a certain point. How come only one came out at the end?
Right.
It's
yeah.
kind of unnerving to think about that. But the theory that I offer, and this is not the point of my book, it's
Yeah.
not something that original with me, but I discuss the controversy about how do wars themselves begin.
Yeah.
And the view that I think is interesting is that what happens around 12,000 BC
Okay.
is that in many, many parts of the world begin seriously running out of game animals, and of course the predators that hunt the game animals. And this means that those humans, probably males, who had specialized in being hunters and defenders of their communities, suddenly didn't have as much to do. Not suddenly,
Yes,
but
right.
spread over a long, long
Sure.
time.
Right. Right.
And the speculation, which is not original to me, is that that war begins almost as a protection racket.
Mm-hmm.
These guys don't have the same amount to do.
Mhm.
There isn't, you know, there aren't lions that they're constantly fighting off to protect the sheep or something. It's not enough hunting because of this great shortage of animals that is happening then, and so they're able to say, hey, look. There's some really rough guys down the river, and so you have to continue to just feed us and let us lie around here because we're your only protection against them.
It was the beginning of civilization. Civilization means city dwelling, and you began to have the. Carl Wittfogel used to write on the Oriental, the source of despotism in the Oriental need to organize. Well, they got, you know, agricultural irrigation system. You need to organize people in larger groups, so you began to have a warrior class. Well, anyway.
Well, we don't know. You
yeah,
see, there's
right,
even
right.
a speculation that the reason people began to live in towns was because of war.
Really?
You know, that
Yeah,
it was,
right.
well, I mean, also
Yeah.
there could have been also predation pressures from animals. But that, you know, by the time you have a thickly walled city like Jericho from about 7,000 BC, very likely, or earlier than that, you know, the fear is of other bands of humans. So it may be that people were being pushed into concentrations by the threat.
And that was sort of, it began to be the source of war. I wonder if that begins then to bring us into some more contemporary notions of war as being, let's go get that grain that those guys have, and so, you know, and begin to develop the aggression within what could be understood as economic interests and that sort of thing begins to have more application in terms as we get closer to our own time? Or
probably there was a tendency to sacralize war going way, way back.
Okay.
I mean, this is, again, somewhat speculative, but one of the earliest ways of sacralizing war, I mean, maybe all you want is the grain in the next town.
But you got to make it noble.
But you have to make it noble. So what you say you're doing is you're going to capture victims for human sacrifice.
Okay,
That you have to feed the gods. You have to appease the gods.
if you want to have the grain,
right?
Yeah.
So that's what you're really doing,
right.
and then that was probably one of the earliest ways of sacralizing the enterprise of war, and that's what the Aztecs did. They said we've got to have wars because we must have these
hearts
human
to
sacrifice.
cut out.
Yeah.
And they did.
And they did. And there even in historical times, there were kingdoms of Africa that also justified war that way. That doesn't mean they didn't have perfectly Clausewitzian motives for their wars, but it was being sacralized probably very early on.
And it's amazing how many of these things live into the modern time. It was interesting, you wrote on Nazism and how they went back to ancient rites of, you know, the Aryan roots and that sort of thing, and that they go back to these roots and they draw upon those in an emotional way that war brings to the surface and serves some sort of a human psychological appetite, if not need, you know?
Well, warriors, I mean, there's certain kind of mystical sorts of warriors, or it holds a mystique. I mean, look, there's all these people that like to reenact Civil War battles.
Oh, aren't there?
Or there was General Patton who believed that in previous incarnations he had fought in the Civil War and possibly many other wars. You know, that warriors do have this sense often, or the more, I don't know whether to say more deluded ones or the more reflective ones,
Yeah.
have this sense that all the way back to Achilles,
Yeah.
there is some kind of lineage
Yeah.
of noble warriors, which they are part of.
I wonder, I did some things with Ravi Batra at one time, and he had a thing, where he saw there's certain kinds of human beings, or there's certain, there are different aspects, and one of them, there seems to be a group of warriors, and there have been warrior classes. There have been intellectuals, there have been, then he's got it into people who are acquisitors or acquisitive in terms of material things and so on, and the masses and so on. Do you think that there are some people within the human population that have a proclivity toward thinking in, quote, warrior terms? And then does that begin to get translated into things like sports and activities and competition and different kinds of ways of thinking that maybe then do spill over into, well, sociological patterns or then into geopolitical patterns? Or are there certain people who have a proclivity to that more than others? And you've written well on gender, and a lot of people have said that it's a gender-based thing. It's the male testosterone and that sort of thing that they're out there working themselves up over. But
well, yeah, I certainly go in at some length here to the gender issue, because I sort of started...
You've written so well on it.
Well, I started out thinking that was going to be the clue to everything.
Yeah.
And certainly this is one of those almost universal divisions of labor, that it's almost universally true that it's men who have done the fighting, who have been the warriors. But it's not universal. I mean, there are also enough exceptions so we know it's not psychologically or physically impossible. Like, just even since this book was written, they've dug up a gravesite somewhere in Russia of young women warriors, young women, teenage women, buried between 2,000 and 3,000 years BC, buried with their weapons and with wound marks in their bones. So there's no question, or there's very little question, that they were fighters, and probably full-time warriors. And if you look at small-scale societies, women may not have been allowed to bear weapons, but they were certainly given some pretty nasty tasks, like often the job of going around the battlefield after the battle and killing the enemy wounded, or torturing the enemy wounded, or whatever. I mean, there's not, I don't think there's a big psychological barrier for women to be violent.
There are probably some people would take exception to that. Right?
Well, but another
people would say,
of
well,
course,
you've written
but I don't know, and I think there may be a difference. Men may be more aggressive in general, but I don't know whether aggression in the individual has a whole lot to do with war.
Yeah. It's interesting also that it would have been a time when brute strength would have been particularly important, and then with the increase of technology, if you can throw a spear, you can be at some distance from the object. You don't have to wrestle the thing to the ground. So the muscle and so forth. And now we're getting down into the modern experience where it's a matter of the brains, of being able to work a computer to run a missile or something. So it's getting more and more divorced from the questions of brute strength that might have been relevant in the early stages, do you think? Is that relevant? Yeah.
No, I mean, if you were fighting in close combat with weapons that require a lot of upper body strength. It's good to be a man, and it's good to be in a rage.
Yes,
because that rage gets you all pumped up and gets those, the blood in the muscle.
Really,
but if you're, going to be shooting guns at each other from a distance,
rather like a brain surgeon.
You don't have to be strong.
No, not at all.
And you don't want to be carried away by any kinds of emotions.
No, you want to be
clear-headed.
Cool. Yes, right.
Cool-headed enough to take aim and have good judgment. So any kinds of reasons for women not being fighters have long since been eliminated.
Yeah. Now they're going into the Virginia Military Institute. And
now, I don't know why anybody wants to go
I don't know
in
either.
There,
I don't understand why anyone would submit themselves to that. Yeah, but that's a question. But again, back to the fact that it has these roots that go back, and we understand now in the biological evolution, that it's all contained within us, isn't it? The evolution. I mean, the reptilian core and so forth, and the evolution. It's all contained within us. The evolutionary process. And do you see, and you talked about Auguste Comte and so forth, that there's been a progression and that there is a biological evolutionary process on this planet, and we have seen mankind in a certain sense apexing that purpose. Some people do. Some people see in a
apexing, what do you mean?
Well, at the head of the evolutionary process in terms of having some linear purpose that people try to perceive in terms of biological evolution. We got Gaia principle coming and so forth, that there's an interlinking of all the species and systems and so forth. But people have gotten a sense of human purpose in terms of we are top of the food chain, we're head of the heap, we're in that kind of a position. Do you find anything in this research that you've done that would cause us to see it differently, or how would you see human purpose in terms of the broader biological evolutionary purpose as it relates to these questions of aggression and war as they've been manifest? Are there, I asked you before, is it a unique thing for species to war against their own kind in terms of broader biological patterns? Ants do, I know. Rats do, I think. And
chimpanzees to a small extent. But as for what we might do with our desire to, or whatever, with our habit of war, let's put it that, call it a habit, is we may think we're at the top of the food chain, but the point that Stephen Jay Gould makes is a very good one. It's really the microbes that rule this planet.
The bacteria.
Yeah, and the viruses. And we are not, by any means, ascendant vis-a-vis them. We still very much are, well, we very much are a prey species with respect to the microbial enemies we have. And if we wanted to get serious about our biological destiny on Earth, we'd have to say, we're not out of the woods. We do have an enemy, many, many enemies, from HIV, all of these things, to the increasingly drug-resistant strains of tuberculosis and so many other things. Let us fight this enemy with some of the kinds of ingenuity and dedication that we have again and again brought to bear against fighting ourselves.
Yes, that's right.
So that, if that would be my stance as a biologist.
Yes, right.
Let's wake up, and we're in trouble here.
Yeah, and let's use some of our the intelligence and the extended technology. It seems to be, in a certain sense, the human species has uniquely been able to, in a certain sense, extend their consciousness, if that's what technology is, out in a certain sense, into the environment. And birds make nests, and they create an environment other than that which, in an Eden-like sense, is given to them as a species. But we have taken that to an extreme degree in terms of being able to change the environment. And I don't know biologically if we have changed that much since Cro-Magnon. I don't know, genetically and so forth. But the technology and the milieu within which we interrelate has changed tremendously, and now is picking up and changing at almost more than exponential patterns with the microprocessor and these kind of things, that we're coming into some sort of, we have a unique capability in order to influence the environment. Do you think that outering of our consciousness is, in a certain sense, any kind of an expression of a, I don't know, to reach for some sort of a poetic metaphor? I mean, it's sort of like an extension outward of consciousness, whether that's an aggressive quality in biological evolution, in a certain sense, or if we if we didn't have that impetus in terms of biological evolution, we would still be in some primordial ooze if there wasn't that impetus to change or to move out.
Yeah,
you understand what I'm trying to get at?
I don't think we should be too concerned about an aggressive aspect to our nature. I mean, certainly there are individuals who are dangerous because they're too aggressive, and they're pathological extremes of that. But I think the tendency has been to think that since war is so widespread and so ancient, it must be that there's some original sin in us, something that's really, really wrong with us.
They've sure gotten that into the religions,
I mean, that's well, yeah, but I mean, it's also when pacifists tend to think about war, they think, how do we become a kinder, gentler, sweeter, better-natured species and stop doing this? And I'm saying, what I come out of this research saying is, no, I don't think there is that flaw in us. I don't think it's testosterone. Here I am, I'm a feminist. I'm letting you guys off the hook.
Good,
I don't think there's something innately wrong. I think that the passions we bring to war are fine passions. This willingness to sacrifice and this solidarity that I was talking about at the beginning. But we have to direct those passions in another way.
Yeah, right.
War, once it gets started on Earth, and this is in a way why the origins are not that important, once war starts, it almost becomes a self-reproducing thing.
Yeah, Mr. Dawkins is talking about what do you call it, a meme?
Well,
you used the term algorithm. These algorithms are coming down
I
from,
mean,
from
I was
biological
grasping
evolution.
because social science does not give you a lot of help in talking about the self-reproductive qualities of certain human institutions. But if you think about war, one war does lead to another, just as one atrocity leads to another.
Yeah, and this revenge pattern.
Yeah, the revenge pattern. So it guarantees, I mean, the Serbs are still fighting the Battle of Kosovo in the 14th century.
Yeah,
so, and then war spreads geographically. The best predictor of whether some society is going to be warlike is ultimately whether the people, around it, the societies around it are warlike. So we had let loose something on the earth about 15,000 years ago, which almost has this life of its own. I no longer feel angry at people who are warriors, who are in the military, because I see that that is part of a system which is very hard for us as a species to break with. But I do feel better about our species than when I started out, because I don't feel there's that terrible aggressiveness. And I think what we have to start doing is seeing that this pattern of warring, this war system, that has become our enemy. Maybe it was once, how we dealt, it has roots in how we actually dealt with a non-human enemy. But it has become our enemy. That is the predator.
And we should marshal all of our forces of war-making solidarity and so forth against the concept of war itself.
Exactly.
Turn the thing on its ear. It's beautiful. That's the way you end the book on that thing. It's really a good idea. And that idea, I was reading at before, that idea that the evolution of the extension of technology is in a certain sense like if there was a consciousness before there was Homo sapiens sapien, there was Australopithecine, and there's something in the evolutionary process. I don't want to say Auguste Comte or progress or some sort of a notion of that. And we understand the bacteriological root of it all and so forth, but that you don't see a pattern of purpose behind evolution or design. Some people are trying. There's a man, Behe, who says that he sees a pattern of design behind this. Some people do. But you don't see it to a purpose to where there was a consciousness before Homo sapiens sapien, and we may be coming to some relationship to the broader cosmic events that is in a certain sense transcendent to what we've been throughout the human experience. I use the line, but James Joyce said, history is a nightmare from which we're attempting to awaken. And that we may come to a time of something that makes an environmental situation that is possible for human beings to safely and with security be able to be a kinder, gentler kind of people and concentrate on, let's say, the arts and the things that are really important rather than the destructive hounds of wars or the scourges of war that the UN and other institutions were set up to try and move us beyond. Maybe in our technological success we're getting to a point where the conditions are different than what they had been throughout the historical experience. I don't know.
Well, I don't know if there's a purpose or any direction to evolution. I'm not, I don't see any evidence of that. And we do see the negative examples, the terrifying examples of the people, say, who lived on Easter Island, who essentially warred themselves to extinction or near extinction.
Did in the resources, right?
Yeah, and there's similar islands in the South Pacific now, which are being understood as where people just used up all the physical resources, fought over the few things that remained, and made themselves extinct. That is one possible scenario for our entire species, is that we keep putting more and more of our resources into militarism and preparations for war, and we don't have the resources as a result to fight against disease or hunger or whatever the other threats are. And we all go the way of Easter Island.
And there's of course an environmental critique of that can come, and we ought to be thoughtful in terms of the broader system of which we are a part. That principle of Gaia is Lovelock and some of these people begin to come to that kind of a situation. Do you think that's a major problem then, that in a Marxian analysis or other analysis where you begin to get to war, they begin to talk about that war is an extension of diplomacy, but there's a competition for scarce resources, or if you go to zero-sum thinking in terms of business organization or other things or other situations, that if you are in if there's a scarcity, that there's going to be competition for that which there's not enough of in order for the object or the entity to survive. But if you begin to overcome scarcity within a situation, the psychological attitude toward the resource base alters. Do you think there's any possibility that we're beginning to move beyond some of the ironclad laws of scarcity that have been the context within which human institutions evolved, including particularly the happy ability for silicon and other kinds of ephemeralization, doing more with less and more ecologically friendly kind of patterns of technological sophistication, nanotechnology and so forth, might make it possible that we're going to supersede on a planetary scale scarcity, and that there is a relationship between competing for scarce resources? Or do you think that doesn't relate? That's a traditional way of thinking about the causes of war, that is fighting over scarce resources and survival of the fittest.
I mean, that is, I should just underscore that that's not what I'm attempting to do in,
no,
in
I'm
this
sorry,
book, though, is to,
no, I understand.
you know, is to explain why war is pessimism, or why the feelings that go with them.
Yeah.
And I was not, though, convinced. I spent a lot of time following up precisely that kind of line of thought. Is there something we can boil war all down to, like scarce resources?
Yeah.
And it doesn't easily work. I mean, once a war has started, like the First World War, you know, you can have so many theories. There was no glaring shortage of resources that the nations of Europe were fighting over. It's you know, after the fact, it becomes an enormous muddle. And even when you can point to some resource, say oil and the the U.S.'s involvement in the Gulf War, and say, well, there it was, scarce resource, we had to do it. You could, that also sometimes looks like an after-the-fact rationalization. But more importantly, you can always say, well, maybe oil was at stake. Was war the answer? I mean, is there anything, no matter how great you can say as the provocation afterwards, is there any provocation that is equal to the moral weight of killing large numbers of human beings?
Yeah, particularly when you get into these super weapons that are, you know, you get into atomic and other kinds of virology things.
Yeah, I mean,
that
I'm
can be
willing
let
to say,
loose. Right.
Oil is a good reason to get angry, maybe, but is it a reason to kill 100,000 people?
Yeah, that is interesting. That is interesting, because you have also the figures in there in the First World War. I think you have the figures in your head, perhaps, but 15% were civilian casualties. By the time we get to the Second World War, it was something like 65% were civilians. So that war began to have an all-out nature, that it was something very disquieting, and that some of these civil strifes and some of these ethnic things, it gets up to 90% of the people are just women and children and so forth.
Yeah,
wiped
Rwanda,
out.
Bosnia, it's
Awful.
90% civilians. There's no protection in not in being a civilian. You might as well have everybody have a gun.
Yeah,
which is what has been happening. You know, we see child soldiers in Africa.
Yeah, it used to make
Iran
more sense
Iraq.
when all the young men would go out in the meadow and fight it out, you know, or something. But now it's not like that, increasingly in the modern experience. Ultimately, when you come down to it, out of this book, it's a trite question, but sometimes those things can be asked and so on. How do you feel? Are you more optimistic, pessimistic about the human prospect as you look 10, 20, 30, 50 years out? From the understandings that you've gleaned from looking and doing the research for this book, Blood Rites? Or what do you think?
No, I didn't expect it, but I came out with a greater respect for my own species. For one thing, I don't think there is any other species, at least none that I have been able to discover, which made such a leap up the food chain as our kind did. That was an amazing accomplishment.
Yay for our team.
Yay for humans. You know?
That's right.
And also to realize that these passions of war are good passions, are not something we want to expunge or wipe out. That they're the same kind of thing that, for example, we bring to a football game often. Or
maybe to a research project, perhaps. Transmogrify them into something that is positive, right?
The desire to be united with other people on some great and serious mission.
Right.
That is the most uplifting thing we know. War has supplied that need for many, many people over thousands of years. Now I'd like us to put that same need into the business of ending war and get excited about stopping those wars.
Right.
If you want to take a risk, lie down in front of the troop train or don't pay your taxes. That's a really risky activity.
Risky in these days,
talk about risk,
you know,
that's enough risk for you.
Well, I think maybe that's what I was getting at when I thought before. If there's any, you know, trying to get at some sort of an idea, is there any purpose? I mean, we're here on the third planet in this time, and you know, and there's a biological evolutionary pattern. Is there any purpose to it against which we could measure what we're here about? Bucky Fuller used to say, there's entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, everything moves to chaos, and that biological purpose was to move across entropy and bring increased patterns of conscious understanding, the process of which we are a part. And he used to call it syntropy, I think, synergistic anti-entropic function that biological evolutionary was. He used to hold it was apex by humanity, and that we're coming to where we understand our position in a conscious, awake kind of way with knowledge in terms of cosmic patterns, you know, but that gets to be in a big pattern, and that would be a large pattern against which we'd get some idea of what our purpose is, because behind a lot of this it does have to do with human purpose and a sense of what human purpose is. Among us, we have a psychological need or need to have an appreciation of that, I guess.
Well, I don't know if we have any purposes other than those we define for ourselves.
And
that's
sort
what
of
I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, and but one of them would be to try and marshal our capabilities against the institution, the irrationalities of the institution of war itself, and that's one of the main things. There is this term. Is it Dawkins who uses the term? Is it a meme or?
Yeah, I was looking for some way to describe a, quote, self-reproducing social activity or institution as is war. And that's where I came across Dawkins, Richard Dawkins' idea of a meme, which was his attempt to define a cultural analogy to a gene, which is a sort of self-reproducing biological entity. And it's, you know, I wouldn't, you know, I would have to wait till this gets a little bit more firmed up. But I was just basically saying we need a better way of thinking about things like war, where we create an institution. You know, at one point there was no war. Humans start doing it. It sort of runs away with itself and appears not to be very much in our control. I mean, the generals are right when they say, hey, we can't disarm, somebody might attack us. Of course, they're not right in the sense that we're constantly arming those people who might attack us, but never mind that. Right. But, you know, that there is a defensive rationale comes into play once you have let that institution of war loose on the planet.
And it has a certain life of its own, and we ought to understand that as a pattern, we can understand, so we can maybe better to combat it and to make it right.
I want us to have the mentality about war that we would have about any enemy, like a human enemy or an animal enemy, and say, how do we uproot this from our lives? How do we fight it in how do we fight it in every possible front which it is encroaching upon us
we've
now?
had the war on poverty, we've had the war on all kinds of, we ought to have the war on war and that sort of thing. Well, you've done a beautiful job with the book, and I congratulate you really very much on it, and it's been your pleasure. Let's let people see how it looks in the bookstores, and it's got, it's Barbara Ehrenreich. Pleased to have been able to welcome to the program Blood, Rites, and it's subtitled again, Origins of the History and History of the Passions of War. Barbara, thank you really very much for coming into MNN. It's been a great pleasure. And we in Conversations invite you to tune in. We'll be coming back again next week at the same time. Once again, Barbara, welcome back again to New York and to the Media and Democracy Conference where you're here in October of 1997. Again, we look forward to seeing you again next week. And once again, Barbara, thank you very much indeed. Until next time. Big subject. So now you're writing you say you're researching now on states of ecstasy, or
the public forms of ecstasy, like football crowds, like
it's amazing
rock and roll crowds.
It's amazing the passions that are raised by that. You know, that kind of thing. So
and they're very much like the nationalist passions of war, and so that was the connection.
Or like or music. You know? Jazz music, where people are playing, and that's one of the things I always kind of like for zero-sum things. If you're playing music and you're playing with somebody in music, you really don't want some zero-sum thing where you're going to do better by the other person doing not well. You want the other person to do very well. And music is really important to the psychology and psyche of people now, because you got people, it's cooperative in a certain sense. You want everyone to do, you know.
I actually would wildly speculate, not on the air, of course, that music may originate in those original confrontations with predators.
Interesting.
You know, that the stamping, the sort of rhythmic activities, which are partly aimed at convincing that predator that you are not just a collection of weak individuals, but you are one big beast.
A resonating something they better answer to, right? Well, there's probably there's a good deal probably to be said for that. Well,